So, hello, everyone who is here. Welcome. Um, I think most people know me as David Gray-Hammond. I run the page Emergent Divergence. Today, I'm joined by Dr. Nick Walker. We were going to be joined by some others, but unfortunately, due to personal circumstance, it's just going to be the two of us. But having had many conversations with Nick, I know she's a wonderful person to have along, and it's going to be a really good conversation. So today we're going to have a webinar about Neuroqueer learning spaces, which is part of a wider project that is sort of being co-led by Autistic Realms and Stimpunks. And we're going to talk for a bit and then maybe take some questions. We'll start with brief audio descriptions. So I'm David Gray-Hammond. I'm a Mediterranean male in his mid-30s. I have a beard, a lip piercing, sunglasses, a shaved head, and an ear stretcher, sat in my very blue room with a bookcase in the background. Nick, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. Hi, I'm Dr. Nick Walker, trans feminine, but I am not physically or cosmetically transitioned. So I have a somewhat masculine appearance, shaved head, and wearing right now a blue blazer over a green sweater, sitting in my sunny living room in Berkeley, California, where it is 11 a.m. right now.
Fantastic. So, neuroqueer learning spaces, I guess a good place to start. I mean, I would imagine that a lot of the people who are interested in this topic probably already have an idea of what neuroqueer theory and neuroqueering is. But Nick, I was wondering if you could tell us in your own words, sort of what is neuroqueer theory and neuroqueering to you?
Sure. Well, neuroqueer theory is an extension of queer theory into the realm of neurodiversity. And so uh, the queer theory looks at how gender and sexuality get constructed, and how cis heteronormativity, binary heterogender roles are socially learned and imposed, and how they can be queered, which means how dominant gender norms can be subverted and creatively messed around with, and we can creatively generate our uh, the genders and sexualities that actually work for us and liberate ourselves from uh, norms imposed by dominant cultures. And so, extending that into the realm of neurodiversity, we get neuroqueer theory and this idea that's central to neuroqueer theory, which is that neuronormativity, or neurotypicality, as it's traditionally been called when the discourse on neurodiversity, that is socially constructed in much the same way that binary gender roles are constructed. And so that also can be subverted and creatively queered. And also that neuronormativity is very entwined with cis heteronormativity, that in a sense the socially enforced performance of neurotypicality is really inseparable from the socially enforced performance of binary gender roles and heteronormativity. And so if you queer one of them enough, you're really queering both of them together. So that's what we're looking at essentially, is how do we queer how do we queer neuronormativity? How do we queer our body minds and our cognitive styles the same way that gender can be queered? And what does it mean when those overlap, when we are queering essentially a gender performance and cognitive performance together?
You for that. It's always nice to sort of be reminded of the way you yourself, as one of the people who, well, really the person responsible for neuroqueer theory. It's always good to hear how you relate that that theory, and I do like the fact that it's an extension of queer theory, because I think sometimes people sort of misinterpret and assume it's about being neurodivergent and queer, and it's as in
Hmm.
the sort of sexuality side of queerness. And obviously that can be part of it, I know,
Hmm.
but sometimes I feel that's a little reductive when we reduce it to those two matters. And something I wanted to highlight, and I wondered if you could just talk on this briefly, is that it's not just neurodivergent people who can neuroqueer, is it?
Right, or it's not. I would say traditionally, when we're talking about the academic field of neurodiversity studies or the activist end of things, the neurodiversity movement, when we're talking about neurodiversity, usually there's a, a a fairly identitarian approach to it with the idea of distinct neurotypes, and you're either neurotypical, or we look at these various innate forms of neurodivergence, autistic people, and uh what I call kinetic cognitive style, what that is often called ADHD or dyslexia. And we look at these specific categories of often innate neurodivergence and contrast those with neurotypicality. But uh, queer theory is really concerned, and by extension, neuroqueer theory is really concerned with fluidity, with the fluidity of self and the fluidity of culture, rather than with fixed identity categories, which always impose artificial limits of the sort that we're trying to transcend. And so I would say the conventional sort of neurodiversity movement perspective has been, you're either neurotypical or you're neurodivergent, and um, neuroqueer theory is really about creative neurodivergence. So it says, nobody is born neurotypical. It's a social construct. Like nobody is born perfectly conforming to a binary gender role performance. Those are learned and can be unlearned and subverted. And so neurotypicality, there's not really any such thing as the neurotypical brain. It's like, oh, you're just born neurotypical and you're a normie for life. That's kind of a bleak view of it, I think. So uh, in a sense, when we say that neuroqueer theory is about neurodivergence, we mean something different, that it's not about people who identify as neurodivergent, but how anybody can become neurodivergent. If you're born already neurodivergent, if you're born autistic or dyslexic or kinetic, then um, then neuroqueering becomes a way of exploring the potentials of that beyond what society has told you can be. And if you're born, you know, without any particular innate form of neurodivergence, if you're born capable of comfortably conforming to neurotypicality, neuroqueering still becomes, oh, how can you become neurodivergent? Because it's more interesting, because neurotypicality is limiting. And so um, in that sense, it's about neurodivergence, but not neurodivergent as in born that way, but neurodivergent as in anybody can diverge from restrictive cognitive norms. And similarly with queerness, in queer theory, queer is conventional queer theory. If you look at like David Halperin and Judith Butler and such, queer is presented not so much as like, oh, you're born queer or you're not. It's it's something that anybody can do, that anybody can seek to transcend the limitations of socially imposed gender and sexual norms. And so, same thing here. It's not about identity or about some innate, like, I was born this way and you weren't born this way. It's about anybody can uh, choose to liberate themselves from socially instilled norms.
And I think that's we're getting close to a good jumping off point here, but I wanted to
Mm-hmm.
add that, one of the things in my own neuroqueering sort of practices is when someone tells me it's impossible to be something, or more so when I think it's impossible to be something, the first thing I think is, why do I think it's impossible to be that? Because
Mm-hmm.
for me, neuroqueer theory, neuroqueering is about opening up possibility. It's about exploring whether a boundary is really a boundary.
Exactly, exactly. It's very much about possibilities, and I think that that's a feature of neuroqueer theory that maybe differentiates it from um, uh, a lot of realms of like critical theory and such, is that ultimately neuroqueer theory is relentlessly positive and optimistic. That it's really about yeah, like let's see what we can do. Let's try this out. That it's um, there's often in activist discourses and in academic like critical theory like Foucault influenced discourses and such. There's this real hopelessness. Oh, everything is about uh, how this or that system is oppressive, or how these categories of identity are doomed to be opposed to each other. And that's so uninteresting to me. It doesn't go anywhere constructive. I'm so interested in what are the possibilities for something more beautiful and creative. And we're just going to explore them, and we're not going to, yeah, as you said, not going to necessarily take anyone's word for what the limitations are.
Yeah, and I'm glad you mentioned the whole systemic oppression thing because, um, one of the things, I talk a lot about things like neurofuturism and
Hmm.
neuroanarchy. And for me, the reason I'm interested in those is because of my experience with this theory of neuroqueer theory. And so I think this applies really well and is a good jumping off point for learning spaces. But the question that I like to ask is, okay, we have a oppressive system. What if we
Hmm.
just didn't have a system? What if we just explored? Like this constant need to fix things in place, and this happens, then that happens, then that happens, and this person's at the top. Like you can't change a system to be less oppressive, in my opinion, because a system by definition is a fixed thing that imposes from the top down. So in terms of learning spaces, this could then, I guess, for people might be wondering right now, okay, so how does this apply to learning spaces? And I know that you're a really good person to ask about this because obviously you are a professor. I know you've definitely been a professor of somatic psychology, wasn't it? Uh,
I have, yeah, somatic psychology and then just general psychology also.
yeah. So how does neuroqueering fit into your lecture halls as a professor?
Interesting. I am, um, it's it's kind of just organically built into my teaching style. So uh, I'm always encouraging students to uh, discover their own potentials and to think critically about whatever ideas we're exploring. Um, I'm very into the collaborative nature of the learning space. To me, that's crucial. Uh, so class discussion features very prominently in all my classes. It's very much there's a strong emphasis on, we read materials, we read reading materials and such, but students are not passive recipients of knowledge. They're co-creating knowledge through, okay, we're engaging with this existing existing bodies of work, but let's think about how does this apply to our lives and our particular cultural experiences and such, and what's working for us? What's working for us as a class? What do we as a class need to explore further based on who we are, what our interests are, what our intentions are for application of the knowledge? And that's really crucial to me. In a sense, there is this continuous uh, queering of um, there's this queering of the top-down structure where I'm acting as a facilitator and a source of knowledge, but I'm encouraging students to look at, well, what knowledge do we bring with us uh, as a class? What knowledge is here in the group, and what curiosities are here in the group, and where are we going to go with it? So I think that's key to it. I do a lot of online teaching these days, but when I get to teach in person in the classroom, which is always a great pleasure, the it becomes even more obviously queer, more obviously neuroqueering, because we're messing with the physical environment. And I teach at California Institute of Integral Studies, which lends itself very well to that because there's a school tradition of very small classrooms and of, you're not all seated in a lecture hall looking at the front of the room. Much more often, people are sitting in a circle and there's people sitting on the floor. And so it lends itself very well to that sort of queering of the physical structures, because if you think about how traditional classroom spaces are set up, there's a disciplining of the body towards normativity that happens just by the way the space is set up, that students are expected to sit and perform attentiveness in this particular normative manner. And uh, the top-down authority structure is very much enforced just by the fact, of students facing the instructor. And so there's a shift if everyone's sitting in a circle, and there's not the same disciplining of the bodies. I'm very explicit about you can sit or stand or lie down however you want. You can move around however you want. And then there becomes it becomes part of the conversation. Like, okay, what if somebody, in order to move, in order to learn well, needs to pace around and stim and move, and somebody else needs stillness and a lack of visual distraction to learn well? How do we structure that? We can structure it so like there's a space in the room where people can move very actively, that's maybe out of the field of vision of the people who need a less visual distraction. So suddenly part of the learning process is how are we sharing space as a neurocognitively diverse group of body minds? And so that becomes very interesting to me. And of course, that happens in the online space is different because people are operating asynchronously and they're not seeing each other. But even there's like people come into the class, into an online class where I do a lot of written online class discussion. And at first, everyone's trying to write what they think academic writing looks like. And sort of encouraging people to, like, yes, we want to be engaged intellectually with material, but what language works for you to express that? And so we start, by the end of the semester, often we're starting to get people contributing to the online discussion in, the form of poetry and, much more uh, individualized styles. And everyone is starting to learn from like, oh, okay, this is, um, you know, this is a new way of thinking about this expressed just simply through how my classmate has uh, expressed their views, like, oh, okay, this can be, I can I can I can engage intellectually with academic topics in a way that is poetic, for instance. And we have, students do video presentations on their research for the semester, and the videos are full of people stimming, and as they talk about what they've been working on for the semester, and everybody's sharing that with everyone else, so students are not just like writing a paper from me to see. They're learning things that they're bringing back to the group. So once again, I'm in the facilitator role there. So yeah, that's kind of my experience with neuroqueering learning spaces so far.
And I like that you talked about the sort of collaboration and being a facilitator, because in my own sort of day job, I do a lot of mentoring, particularly with young people and children. Um,
Hmm.
they're all neurodivergent themselves, but regardless of that, the first thing that's important to know for me anyway, when I'm trying to incorporate neuroqueering into my mentoring, is that just because everyone's neurodivergent doesn't mean there's a one size fits all.
Hmm.
You know, so the first question I like to think about is, how can I help this person teach me what they need to learn? Because
Hmm.
for me, I like to remove that hierarchy. I'm not in a position of power. I'm facilitating. And the minute I'm in a position of power in that relationship, I am beginning to enforce certain things, which may not necessarily be true for their own experience. And a lot of my work is around mentoring into neurodivergent experience. And something I like people to know is, you can disagree with me. We can disagree and we can explore that,
Hmm.
and we can see where we end up from that disagreement, because not everything I hold to be true is everything you'll hold to be true. And just because I disagree with something doesn't mean that I am instantly correct because I am the one you're coming to for this. You know, I like to, even, and this is the thing, even with young children, and I've worked with children sort of 5, 6 years old, they can teach you things just as easily as you can teach them things. Now, they may be different things, but certainly when it comes to how a child or a young person learns best, I'm not going to go to sort of, educational references that were written back in the 60s that say you should teach
Hmm.
like this. I want the child to tell me how they like to learn, because if I'm not meeting their needs, it's not going to be as effective. So for me, I think that the biggest part of sort of neuroqueering in my own sort of learning spaces is that removal of hierarchy. And the removal of expectation as well. You tell me how you want to use this space. You tell me what it is that you want to learn. Obviously, it's a bit easier for me to do that in this space because I'm not teaching like a course that has a certain amount of knowledge that needs to be gained by the end. Because I'm doing sort of mentoring around their experience as a neurodivergent person, I can get quite creative, and I like to employ different sorts of approaches depending on who I'm mentoring. And one of the things that I like about that is that I feel, as someone in a sort of facilitator position, I have learned so much more through not taking the lead all the time.
Hmm.
Um, and I think that's it's a privilege in a sense. It's a wonderful thing to be in that position where you don't feel the need to impose a system upon people. Um, but I guess people might be wondering, okay, so we've had a good indication of how you dismantle the physical structure in lecture halls, and you can and then sort of change the way the physical layout of the delivery of information and things like that. I guess people might be wondering, because I think a lot of people think that, well, we have to have a system in schools because, how are kids going to learn if we don't have a way of teaching them? And I guess I was wondering, when it comes to, say, younger sort of young people who are still, I guess they'd be in grade school in America or primary or secondary school in the UK. Um, what are your thoughts on what are some of the aspects that perhaps you might start with to tweaking?
Well, I have to say I'm not particularly expert on the younger years of education. But I do want to um, actually go back a little bit. I want to backtrack slightly on our conversation and speak in defense of authority and hierarchy
Okay.
because I think uh, I think that's necessary and it's queerable. And so I'm very into queering it without eliminating it. I think systems are necessary. We need, um, you know, uh, we do need structures in place for certain sorts of learning, even just when students just following the schedule of this is when our class is meeting and this is when assignments are due. And people come into my online classes especially, and there's it's very structured in a way that's very helpful to students, and often especially to certain kinds of neurodivergent students, autistic and kinetic students, that I use a high level of structure in the class. It is very systematized in the sense of, okay, every week we do this. Like every week, here's an introductory video lecture, and here's where you find the list of readings, and here's, by this day, make a discussion post on this, and there's the consistency of the system becomes valuable. And I think it's valuable for younger children too. Often consistency is very good for a young child's sense of safety and self-regulation, which then makes it easier for them to learn. And so systems can be good uh, and necessary. It's just how do we make them non-oppressive? And a lot of that is being willing to be flexible about them, say what's actually working for the students, not, oh, we're doing it my way because I said so, but this is the rationale behind the system. And it's open to negotiation and flexibility if it's not working for the people coming in to learn. Um, where is it possible to be flexible? Where can we find where is it like, okay, we're not in a position to be flexible about, everybody has to be here for class, but is there a way that we can work with this to make it work for everyone? So flexible systems and systems that are continually responsive to feedback. I gotta highly recommend the work of Stafford Beer, the 20th century cyberneticist, because he was probably the best systems thinker I've ever of his work I've ever encountered, and he was mostly focused on corporate and governmental systems rather than education systems, but his work is very generalizable. But he's very into this like cybernetic systems thing of, everybody, people are involved in one part of the system, have to understand it in a particular way, and it becomes not a conventional corporate or governmental hierarchy, but like, okay, here's a group of people who are collaborating on this in this area to work on this part of the system. And how do the different groups and pods within the system rhizomatically collaborate with each other, and how do we make the system continually responsive to feedback from within and without? And the kind of flexibility that Beer's sort of cybernetic approach to systems creates, it's so different from how systems are commonly envisioned in the dominant society, and especially in like the you know uh, real like imperial and colonizer societies. It's a drastically different approach, and it works fabulously well. So I think that Um, part of my part of what I'm getting at with neuroqueer theory in general and with the positivity of it is that you know, in a sense, I'm queering and pushing back a little bit against some of the postmodern critical theorists like Foucault and Deleuze and Guattari, where it's very much like, oh, this is always oppressive and we have to tear it down. And my approach is like, no, let's find how we can change it. Like maybe it's the problem is not systems or hierarchy, but how are we doing systems and hierarchy, and can we do them better and make them more flexible? Um, I'm a fan of temporary consensual hierarchy.
Mm.
And so students come into my classroom, they're making an agreement like they're accepting me as the instructor for the time that we're in class together, which is very different from, oh, I'm better than you and I know all. But it's more like part of the rules of this space you're coming into is that I'm the one ultimately in charge of facilitating it. And without that, um, it's actually difficult to learn certain things because learning often pushes people outside their comfort zones. And so if we're doing a consensus model, if we're only going to explore territory that everyone is eager to explore, um, people tend to stay in their comfort zones and not necessarily learn new things. And so if I'm training a bunch of psychotherapists, for instance, when I'm teaching a graduate class and I'm training students who are trained to be psychotherapists, um, I'm in the position of saying, you know, we're going to look at some very uncomfortable topics. Like here, we have to learn about professional ethics, or we have to role play like what happens when your client brings up this potentially very triggering issue. And, um, you know, people will groan and say, oh boy, this is going to be hard and all that. And I think that it's very easy for a group to just agree if there's no one in charge of saying, nope, we got to do this. It's very easy for a group to just agree to bypass the things that are uncomfortable. And so in a sense, there's like, okay, um, I don't think it's ethical to force anyone outside of their comfort zone, but students come into my class and I'm right from the start, I'm like, let's be clear about what we're doing here. Like it's going to be my job to bring the conversation outside of your comfort zones
Mm.
sometimes. And it becomes, and then we negotiate rules. How does that work? And how do we handle things like, trigger warnings and when somebody really is not prepared to deal with something, what's the procedure for saying I need to sit this one out? Um, it becomes negotiable and consensual, but ultimately it's like the learning is served by having some level of hierarchy in place. And this was really, to me, this is um, sort of crucial to my philosophy of learning because, I started out with Aikido. I've been an Aikido teacher my whole life, and in my whole adult life, I started training in Aikido when I was 12. I was teaching by the time I was in my late teens, and that's become. And I didn't start, I didn't start going to college until I was in my 30s, and so my model for learning process is very much based on my experiences in Aikido, where it's like there's a lot of hierarchy and a lot of formality, very formal systems and structures, very formal, like traditional Japanese martial arts etiquette. And it's so good for the learning process. And I went through this stage in my 20s and early 30s, uh, where I was like, well, I'm going to apply my anarchist politics here and start eliminating traditional etiquette and hierarchies and such. And it was a disaster. it doesn't work for actually teaching people Aikido because so much of the art involves, uh, for one thing, um, uh, people going outside their comfort zone and sort of always working right at the edge of their comfort zone. And uh, part of the instructor's role is to assess what each student needs to work on and develop in their practice. And until one is very advanced at the art, it's difficult to accurately self-assess what needs to work on. That's kind of what instructors are for. And also the traditional etiquette is following the traditional etiquette, which is very counterintuitive, especially to someone not raised Japanese. It's a mindfulness practice, requires a great deal of attention, and it creates an atmosphere of mindfulness and ritual that's necessary for safe practice.
Mm.
And so that intensely formalized, ritualized container, it was like by dismantling it, I found out why it evolved in the first place. Like, oh, this wasn't just a bunch of, old like samurai era control freaks. This was like generations and generations of martial artists discovering what enabled people to learn well and learn safely and mindfully. And so these days, I'm very big on formal etiquette. And I got to say, it surprises the heck out of people because people come sometimes and seek out my teaching, because they've read my writing and are used to my very anarchistic and liberatory ideals, and sort of very surprised to find what a stickler for formal etiquette and traditional martial arts class structure I am. But I do it because it works. And I think it's unethical to impose that level of structure and hierarchy on people who don't consent to it. But nobody's in my dojo non-consensually.
Mm. I think perhaps this is one of the problems with sort of, in the UK current education systems. There isn't really a consent element to it. It is you have to go
Mm-hmm.
to school, it's the law,
Right.
and so it's a question of, well, we've got to find the school that best meets their needs, but is still going to force this very one size fits all approach, whether they like it or not. But it was interesting what you said about, when you're teaching, one of the things is stepping outside the comfort zone, because by its definition, that's almost what neuroqueering asks us to do.
Mm-hmm.
We are saying, how do I queer this? How do I subvert this? That's not necessarily a comfortable process, because we are asking ourselves to do things that might not feel natural at first, because we have been so conditioned to believe the things we were already doing are natural. But I liked what you were saying about queering the system as opposed to completely dismantling it. I wanted to relate that to the opening of your book, Neuroqueer Heresies, where you talk about throw away the master's tools,
Mm-hmm.
because you you talk about the fact that the tools of the system are not designed to change the system.
Right.
So to create something new, something, I don't want to say better, but something new, because we can't know if something's better till we get there. Um, but to create something new, we kind of got to queer the tools as well. We've got to reinvent the tools. We've got to even maybe make some entirely new tools.
Mm-hmm.
And I was wondering, if there's educators watching this wondering, what does that mean for me in my education practice? Like, how would one queer the tools of the education system? Do you have any thoughts on that?
In a sense, yeah, that's a wonderful question. And I think in a sense, we've already been talking about it a bit because queering hierarchy and queering structure is very different from a limiting hierarchy and a limiting structure.
Yeah.
In a sense, how can we use it? We have these traditions of particular structures and hierarchies, and instead of saying, oh, it's no good, we have to tear it all down, you know, uh, which has often been the sort of the postmodernist scholarship approach, for instance, or the radical activist approach. It's, well, it can actually be changed. It can be subverted towards better purposes if we're conscious about it. And that's, I mean, Aikido is a mindfulness practice, and I'm like you're a meditator also. We are mindfulness practitioners, and there's people who have a cringe reaction to mindfulness because of how it gets used in like cognitive behavioral therapy and such. But I think that mindfulness in the really traditional in the sense of really traditional spiritual paths, like Zen Buddhism and such. I mean, that's invaluable. And of course, my background also, I am a psychology professor. I'm a psychoanalytic theory geek, and you can see that in my writings on neuroqueer. I'm citing like a lot of the writings on neurodiversity. People are citing like disability theorists and critical theorists and such, and I'm citing Wilhelm Reich and D.W. Winnicott. So when I think um, you know in psychodynamic psychology, this central goal is Carl Jung said is to make the unconscious conscious. And so that whole mindfulness and that whole psychodynamic idea of making the unconscious conscious, I think, is key to queering systems. Is that we, instead of going along with the system because this is how it's done, we move to a meta level and start thinking consciously about what do we want this system to do, and what does the system actually do right now, and how can we change the system so that it does what we want it to do instead of whatever the heck it's doing.
Yeah, and it seems to me, sort of reflecting on this conversation, like perhaps one of the problems with contemporary approaches to what are seen as oppressive structures, particularly within the education system. You talk about people saying tear it all down, but actually, it seems almost like that being that reactionary is a barrier to effective queering because you're so focused on tearing down what's there, you're not actually trying to subvert anything. It's an act of demolition rather than exploration.
Mm-hmm. Right. And realistically, what are we going to do in terms of tearing down? It's like you know, you can't um to some extent things can't be torn down. To some extent it's like uh these um these systems and structures and language itself is a system that contributes to the shaping of thought and interaction and such. We have these things and we're not going to tear them down. What you would have to do to your psyche to uh, remove language from it entirely. And would that even be desirable? How would you communicate about your work with anyone else? Right. So there's systems that we're not going to get rid of. We're not going to just purge them with fire so that it becomes, well, how do we subvert them? Um, and the um, and and of course things can be turned uh, to new purposes. They can be subverted. So this is funny thing: the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house. Like, what are the master's tools, and what extent is something like, okay, this is one of the master's tools. This is intrinsically part of the problem. And to what extent is something repurposable? To what extent is it like, okay, we can change this into we can change this tool into something entirely different. And uh, you know, what do we actually want to dismantle and what do we want to reshape as we go? It's, you know, I mean, we think about it like the dominant cultures get ingrained in our very bodies, in our embodiment. And that's something, you know, I talk a lot about embodiment and talking about neuroqueering, that it's a very embodied process. You know, and of course, Judith Butler, you know, says this about gender as well. This is learned through bodily performance. Um, so obviously, you know, it's not going to be very helpful to try to get rid of our bodies. You know, destroying the physical body is not necessarily a path to liberation. And so so we really have to think, okay, well, to what extent is our embodiment, you know, part of the master's tools, like this particular way of embodying ourselves that we've learned? To what extent is this, you know, make us cogs in the machinery of capitalism, for instance? And to what extent is it subvertible? Because that's the only option we have. You know, destroying our own body ends the game. So um, it becomes, okay, well, I have developed this particular body, and it has been shaped by my genetics and cultural experience in a particular way. And what am I going to do with it now? What are its potentials now that might make it more liberatory, as both, you know, in terms of my self-liberation and in terms of how I can be a less oppressive and more liberatory presence within my communities and within the world? Um, we kind of have to be engaged in this process of continual transformation if we want to liberate ourselves on a bodily level, because the tear it all down isn't an option on the bodily level.
I'd point out to members of the neurodiversity movement watching this that to an extent we have already begun the queering of embodiment, because we looked at the there's been that very famous thing for many years now about having quiet hands, and autistic people don't
Mm-hmm.
want to have quiet hands. So the master's tool was to have quiet hands, but we are refusing to have quiet hands and exploring what that means for us.
Right. And I'll say, yeah, and that's a perfect example. It's a great example because, of course, the master's tool is not having hands. Hands are not the problem. It's the specific disciplining of the hands, um, and the and even quiet hands. Interestingly enough, like um, it's possible, like, okay, learning to stim, learning to recover the use of the hands, what use of my hands works for me, that goes outside of the normative. But then also like, okay, maybe I'm doing a meditation practice where I'm really accustomed to always doing something with my hands, and it suddenly becomes extremely educational for me to keep my hands still during this meditation practice and see what arises when I don't uh, express that energy through my hands. What happens to my consciousness? Oh, and suddenly I've reclaimed quiet hands as a tool of meditation for my own benefit instead of as a tool for performing normativity for somebody else's benefit.
I suppose the reactionary approach would have been, well, you tell me to have quiet hands, so I'll just cut off my hands. Now
Right.
you've got no hands.
Right, right. Yes, we want to avoid that approach.
But yeah, well, this has been really good so far. We're definitely going to have to do some other parts to this. I'm aware that Helen of Autistic Realms is in the comments, so if there are any questions, now would be a good time to throw them in there. I do see we've had a comment from Nellie Fraser saying, visual descriptors, I come from an arts perspective. There is a hierarchy in expected writing practices. That's
There is indeed.
yeah.
And
Uh,
so yeah, that becomes one of the things that we can, you know, we can look at. To what extent is this useful and to what extent is it, you know, exclusionary? You know, how uh, writing practices and like any other sort of learning and communication practices, I think that um, there's a conventional academic writing style, that's very like Western European, and has a particular, has this and sort of almost deliberately dense and opaque, and that can be, you know, is definitely intended to be accessible only to people who've received certain kinds of education, and uh, and there is and there's this hierarchy of like, okay, you've got to write this way to be published in a peer-reviewed journal, and we're only going to respect your work if it's published in a peer-reviewed journal. And we're in academics are in the process of subverting that. Like I've watched that change, in a sense. Increasingly, I see academic publications that where there's writing and poetry, and where there's visual art appearing, and where people are writing in whatever dialects they grew up speaking, and where that becomes part of the piece, that the subversion of more conventional, rigid academic forms becomes part of the message of the piece, but also allows better communication of certain ideas. So I think that's in the process of happening, and is just going to increase over time. And that's something I tell my students too, because again, students come into my classes and they're writing very rigidly because they've been taught that there's a certain kind of acceptable academic writing, even if they weren't taught that in college. Sometimes they were just picked that up. They were like, you know, it's just pervasive in the culture, the idea that writing has to be very stiff and formal, and you can't use the first person, and you don't use contractions, and it has to be structured this way. And I very much encourage my students, just talk normal, write like you talk. Um, and the key thing is it comprehensible? Are you effectively communicating your ideas?
Mm.
And the conventional academic forms um, can sometimes be an aid in that, but often they can make it impossible to communicate certain ideas well. And so it's like, okay, time to you know, time to drop the things that aren't working for you. So I think um, there's this question of how you teach people to communicate uh, in a coherent fashion, in an effective fashion that actually gets their ideas understood by other people. But at the same time, you drop the hierarchy of, oh, writing like a 19th century Oxford scholar does not make your writing superior to somebody who writes like a rapper. It's just, are your ideas actually coherent to someone who wants to understand them?
Yeah. And
Uh,
if I might backtrack just briefly to something, because you
yes,
were talking about identifying what's useful. Um,
right.
I just, correct me if I'm wrong, my interpretation of neuroqueer theory, however, is that it's not about making things more useful, because it's more of a exploration of what can be, and we might stick with things because they're more useful, but it's not necessarily the goal of neuroqueering doesn't have to be I'm doing this because it's more useful.
This is a wonderful point. I want to clarify here. I'm really glad you brought this up. I want to clarify here what I mean by useful, because useful has a particular definition in capitalism, which is not what I mean. Capitalism is like, does it serve production? Does it serve the machinery of production that creates wealth for the bosses? And uh, when I say useful, part of that is thinking about, again, what purpose do I want to accomplish? And so when I say useful, I mean, is it useful for the purpose at hand, for the purpose that you've decided you want to accomplish in this particular case? And so if, for instance, my purpose, um, contrary to capitalism, where the purpose is always serve the machinery of production and consumption, my purpose might be liberation. It might be exploration of new kinds of consciousness. It might be connection. My purpose might just be pleasure. That's the thing, is that is this way of using my hands useful? Doesn't mean, does this make me better able to focus so I can produce more work for the capitalist economy? It might just mean, is it useful? My goal is to feel good. Does it feel good to do this?
In that sense, you are querying usefulness also.
Yes. Oh, that's a wonderful point. We got to put that in our Neuroqueer theory book. Definitely. Yes, we are querying the very definition of usefulness to reclaim it from capitalism.
Yes. And so we have Helen's put a question in the chat here, and Helen wanted to ask, how do we integrate and collaborate within parallel movements? So neuroqueering, as it is necessarily intertwined with decolonizing, anti-racist, disability justice, those sorts of things. Where does it? I mean, I can see where it fits, but where
Mhm.
would you say it fits within all of these various end goals?
Well, neuroqueering deals on a very meta level in a sense, because we are looking at, well, what are our purposes and how can we alter our systems, including our own body minds, our own ways of moving and thinking and being? How can we alter those to serve the purposes that we want to serve? And so, um, when we're looking at, for instance, um, decolonizing, or we're looking at undoing racism, we need to ask ourselves, well, what is the real goal here in a positive sense? What does it look like? Decolonizing again, okay, well, what might a decolonized system look like? Rather than just, oh, tear down anything we think might be colonial, or what does a non-racist community or world or body mind look like? What is that? And how do we start undoing it with our own bodies and our own systems? Like, is there uh I mean, critical race theory uh places a lot of focus on systemic racism. How is it built into social systems? But the thing is, you can create an excellent system. You can create a system where on paper, you know, nothing is racist. But if people are harboring the racism in how they embody themselves, if people are tensing their bodies uh, and locking down their minds when they encounter racialized groups different from themselves, if people are still responding based on skin color to, like, oh, this person is the other, and shutting them out, we still are going to have racism. The racism seeps back into the systems. And so how do we undo it on a direct bodily level? What does it mean to undo it from the inside out in ourselves? And what's our goal there? What's our again, like, um, and what concepts are inherently the master's tools and what aren't? I mean, we have some very interesting anti-racist scholarship coming out from young Black scholars like Sheena Mason and Coleman Hughes, who were saying, the entire concept of race was racist in the first place and is not necessarily reclaimable. And so how do we purge the concept from our way of thinking and our cultures, um, in order to move beyond it. And so there's some very interesting ideas starting to develop around, yeah, what does it actually take, in terms of, again, the neuroqueer approach is, um, hacking our own bodies and our own conceptual systems, even, in order to, you know, in order to make sure that the systems of oppression are not living in us and that we're not bringing those systems with us.
Absolutely. And it makes me think about the fact that, and I think this is going to have to be a closing point because we're sort of at the end of our time. But when it comes to neuroqueer learning spaces, one of the most important things that has to be considered is the relationship between the individual body minds within the learning space and the system of the learning space itself, because they are not two separate entities. They are intertwined with one another. And like you said, you could have a perfect system, but that doesn't account for what the body mind is doing.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I think that's a really interesting point. We definitely need to have some more of these conversations, I think,
Oh,
for
we
the
definitely
Neuroqueer
do.
learning spaces, and hopefully more people will be able to join us in future, on the discussion. But thank you so much, Nick, for your insights. As always, it's been an absolute pleasure. It almost feels like getting a free lecture every time I come to university again, and getting a free time of learning every time I get to talk to you. And I always come away from these discussions feeling very empowered. So thank you for that. And yeah, I'm going to let you go, and well, I'm going to end the live anyway. And we will thank you everyone who's tuned in, and we'll see you all in the next one.
Thank you.